providing a fresh perspective on the events shaping the cannabis industry. With your host, Deputy Chief of Roc NORML,
Steve Vanderwall.
From business and politics to medicine and technology, and everything in between, this is Roc NORML Radio.
What is up, everyone? I hope you all had a great Memorial Day weekend. We have a ton to discuss today, so let's get right to it. On Friday evening, May 24th, a new version of the MRTA was released. This is the bill that, remember, is championed by Senator Liz Krueger and Assemblywoman Crystal Peoples-Stokes, and a bill that we've been heavily lobbying for over the past year. Here to talk about this bill today is Jason Klimek, Legislative Director of Roc NORML and Tax Attorney at Boiling Code. Jason focuses his practice on cannabis companies as well as startup and small to mid-sized tech companies. He advises clients on entity selection, taxation, regulatory issues, funding, employment matters, and securities transactions. In addition, he advises clients on various complex taxation and federal tax compliance issues affecting business owners within the cannabis industry. As a member of the New York State Bar Association's Committee on Cannabis Law and chair of the Cannabis Practice Group at Boiling Code, Jason has been at the forefront of New York's emerging cannabis law. He has worked with New York legislators, providing analyses regarding taxation and licensing. Jason is also a regular columnist in local publications, writing articles about cannabis, entity structure, corporate taxation, partnership taxation, taxation of intellectual property, and personal taxation. Ladies and gentlemen, it is with my great pleasure to introduce my good friend, colleague, and the Legislative Director of Roc NORML, Jason Klimek. What's going on, man?
Well, thank you very much, Steve, for that wonderful introduction that you definitely didn't read off of the thing I provided you.
You did a pretty good job showing how great you are. It seems that you are the king of cannabis taxation. And I'd say arguably the most complicated part about legalizing cannabis in New York State has been in the realm of taxation, specifically in creating a tax plan that allows the state to both benefit financially but doesn't overtax the consumer and drive them into the underground market. And there seems to be a sweet spot. And in your expert opinion, what is that sweet spot, if there is one?
So, we can look at certain states. Colorado tends to be one of the best ones because we've seen that their market has been relatively successful. They haven't seen a flourishing illicit market. They've slowly been able to try to, tamp down that market. Whereas if we look at California, they've had major problems. Now, granted, they've only been legal for roughly a year, so they're still working things out. But one of the fundamental differences that we see between the two is that Colorado has a flat tax of currently 30%. It's 30% paid at wholesale and 30% paid at retail. 15% paid at wholesale, 15% paid at retail. For California, their taxes total out to about 45%, and they do what actually New York is proposing to do is a weight-based tax. And so their tax rates, I think, are roughly 30 cents per gram for flower and 10 cents per gram for trim. New York is now taking, I'm going to say probably the worst of both worlds, and saying that we need to tax flower at a gram or at $1 per gram and trim at 25 cents per gram. And on top of all of that, we need to have a 20% flat tax. Oh, and by the way, also sales tax of, roughly about 8%. So when you total that all out without the sales tax, so just the weight-based and the 20%, you end up with a 66% tax rate. Tack on another 8%, we're now at 74%.
How are you supposed to make any money as a business?
And how are you supposed to keep your consumers out of the illicit market? Because what we saw, so if you look at the prices in California and Colorado, Colorado's average legal price is about 3% more than the illicit market, which the consumers are kind of fine with. There's a little bit of price insensitivity. But when you do the math in California, you find out that their prices on average are about 11% higher than the illicit market. That's not huge, but it's big enough that it produced a $101 million revenue shortfall from their initial projections. That's not nothing, especially if you look at the Department of Health's calculations that they had put out after Cuomo requested that they do that, where they said that New York could expect to generate between $300 and $700 million per year. You miss that by potentially a third. That's not a small mistake. So with a 66 or really 74% excise tax, we would be roughly 30 to 40% above the illicit market prices. That's probably going to be a little bit of an issue, I'm thinking.
Sounds like we're going to have an influx into the illicit market. But that's a high tax rate wouldn't be the only thing that would be plaguing small businesses. Can you tell me a little bit about 1080E?
280E.
280E.
In fact, I can. So 280E is this rather draconian provision in the federal tax law that was enacted, I think it was in the 70s, but it was kind of leading up to the whole war on drugs. And basically what it says is, I'll get a tax lawyer for a second, is if you traffic in a controlled substance, of which cannabis is Schedule 1, you are denied all deductions except for cost of goods sold. So what does that mean exactly? Well, normally if I have an average business, I sell things that are not controlled substances. I have revenue that comes in. Then I have expenses, my employees and whatever. Once I net my revenue and expenses, I get profit, and I'm taxed on that profit. So if we put some numbers to it, let's say that I generate $100,000 in revenue, and I spend $30,000 on employees, rent, and whatever. That means I have profit of $70,000, and that's what I'm taxed on. What 280E essentially says is, well, other than the costs that it took to actually make the thing or sell the thing that you're selling, you can't take those deductions. So if we look at a dispensary, and dispensaries are the ones that kind of get hit the hardest on this, dispensaries, their only cost of goods is to buy the cannabis that they're going to sell, because that's the only thing, that's their good. Their good that they sell is cannabis. So their employees are not cost of goods. The rent is not cost of goods. The utilities are not cost of goods. So let's take that same $100,000 of revenue and $30,000 of expenses. And let's say that 10,000 of those 30,000 were buying the cannabis. The other 20,000 were employees and all that stuff. What 280E says is that instead of being taxed on 70,000, which is 100,000 of revenue minus the 30,000 of expenses, you're going to be taxed on 90,000 because it's 100,000 of revenue minus $10,000 for the cost of goods, the cannabis, but not the 20,000 for employees and all that stuff. So you're taxed on money that you spent. That's a problem.
It sounds like a recipe to lose money. And, for a bill that we're trying to push to that encompasses and builds a thriving small business industry, we can't expect small businesses to enter the industry and be able to make any sort of money, let alone profit, when you're getting hit with, a 60 or a 74% tax coupled with the stuff from 280E. If New York was to go legal, next month, would 280E still fit into this equation at the state level?
Absolutely. It's federal law. You don't get a choice. In fact, so funny, and we've actually been, trying to do the opposite with the MRTA, is if this new bill goes through, it will actually benefit medical companies, because currently medical companies are subject to 280E both at the federal and the state levels. New York never decoupled the law. So even though medical marijuana is legal in New York, the companies are still denied the deduction for everything but cost of goods sold. So actually, if this bill goes through, they'll actually get a little relief too, but as will every other state or every other company within the state. But again, only on state taxes, not federal. Federal, you're still going to pay. So that's a problem.
So we think that you have created a solution to what we believe is the optimal tax strategy. Tell me a little bit about your tax proposal.
So this is getting floated in the capital right now.
Kind of a big deal.
Yeah, just a little something. So we'll see what happens. But essentially, New York State has what's called a franchise tax. Every company pays it, and it's based on revenue. So it's just think of kind of like your personal tax rate is it's broken up into brackets. So your revenue is under 100,000, you pay X amount. Your revenue is between 100 and 500, it's Y amount, so on and so forth, all the way up to a certain amount. And the reason that it's important that it's revenue is profit is easy to hide. One of the quickest ways to hide profit is, oh, now I'm an employee of my company and I'm pulling down a giant salary. Congrats, now I don't have profit. So we can't do it on profit because as a tax attorney, I'll make sure there is none. Revenue you can't hide. Either you sold something or you didn't. And if you didn't, you're not going to have a business. So revenue, I think, is the right model. And what it does is it basically recognizes that small businesses don't benefit from the economies of scale that big businesses do. If I'm a big business, I can buy tons of whatever it is, fertilizer, hydroponics, whatever it is, I can buy a ton. And because I can buy a ton, I'm going to probably get a pretty decent discount. Small businesses can't do that. Also, small businesses aren't as well funded. They can't hire expensive tax attorneys. Sometimes, cut them deals. So all that equals is small businesses pay a lot more money. And to think that they should pay the same excise tax rate is crazy. All that will mean is that small businesses, when they're selling to dispensaries, will have more expensive products. And what will that do? Well, we know, as I talked about earlier, the market is pretty price sensitive. I mean, you got about a 10% window and that's it. And if you're talking about a $30 eighth or something like that, that's $3. That's not a big amount of money for a consumer to be like, yeah, I'm not going to go with that product. So the goal of my proposal is to recognize that smaller businesses should pay lower rates and bigger businesses should pay more rates. I mean, that's kind of how we run this entire tax system in the state and in the country. It's not just a flat tax. It's based on how big you are, essentially. And so there's been a lot of interest in it. We'll see if it can actually get in. We have about a week to make any revisions before the vote. So hopefully Albany and its notoriously slow deliberative process can speed it up a little.
Yeah, wouldn't that be nice? I mean, I wouldn't hold my breath. We know how Albany works, but we are heading down to Albany this week for a full lobby day to discuss the bill. Mainly a lot of it will be around the discussion of this new tax program. And a lot of it will be around the notion of vertical integration and what that means for the existing registered organizations, which are also known as, the medical companies. Why is it important that, well, let me back up for a second. What does the current version of the MRTA say in regards to vertical integration?
Well, so just like everything, it's complex. If we're just talking about potential licensees into the adult use market, let's forget about the ROs for a second. For those people just in the adult use, they cannot be vertically integrated, meaning it basically draws a hard line between wholesale and retail. So if we're a cultivator, processor, distributor, you cannot hold a retail license, and vice versa. You're a retailer, you can't hold any of those three licenses. And the idea is that vertical integration, when you look at it on a macroeconomic scale, vertical integration really encourages monopolization. It's very, very beneficial to large businesses. If you own every aspect of your process, you're not adding a profit level at every process. So think about it. If you are a separate cultivator and a separate dispensary, there's a profit level for each of those. You can't expect the dispensary to not make a profit. Whereas if you're a vertically integrated company, you're benefiting from the efficiencies that you're doing it all within that company, and you're not worried about so much a profit margin at every single level. You just want an overall profit margin. So by dividing the market into basically wholesale and resale, the idea the idea is that it would allow small businesses to compete. And that's, we can look at other sectors, like look at entertainment, the movie studios, TV, internet, they're owned by like 3 companies. There's no real good competition. So it's very much a recognition of that. Now, if we bring in the ROs, now it's a little something different. So right now, the medical law requires all ROs to be vertically integrated. So if you're a medical RO, Columbia Care, MedMen, PharmaCann, you have to cultivate, process, distribute, and own a dispensary. So how does that jive with what I just talked about in adult use? Well, the proposal, which may or may not get changed, I don't know, hopefully we'll find out tomorrow, is that the ROs would be allowed, almost as a matter of right, to apply for regular adult use licenses, and they would be subject to the same restrictions. So if you have an RO that's fully vertically integrated and they apply for adult processor or adult cultivation license, let's call it, they could not also own an adult use dispensary. They can still keep their medical stuff, but they can't sell their adult use cannabis in their medical dispensary, and they can't own a separate adult use dispensary. However, so that's actually not terrible. However, there's always a but. And in this case, there is a special one-time fee that they can pay in order to bypass the restriction on vertical integration, and they would be allowed to have vertically integrated companies in both the medical and recreational. That's probably an issue. That pretty much goes against what the people of New York want, what the goal of the legislation really was. And it really hurts small business because now you have these giant, MedMen is funded, I think they're worth 10 billion, something like that.
Well over $1 billion at this point.
Yes. Even if you have $100 million, which let's face it, that's a lot of money, you're not competing with MedMen. 100 million on $1 billion is nothing. So that's why we're very concerned about the vertical integration.
Well, what's interesting is this new one-time fee, right? They're going to allow the ROs to pay this one-time fee, which grants them access into the adult use market. And they had said that they're going to use that money for things like funding incubators or low-interest loans, which that sounds, warm and fuzzy, but unless that these fees are like $10 million a piece, it's not really going to make a dent, because even if it was, let's call it $1 million, right? That's fair. With the current existing 10 ROs, you're looking at $10 million max to fund incubation in low income loans, especially when you can't even go to a bank that has federal assets and get a loan. That's a slap in the face. So rationally, that doesn't make any sense. I think that the ROs are going to get probably a small victory when it comes to the negotiation table. But, we go back to small business and we continue to talk about why it is so important to have this industry to be small business focused. And we talk about the intricacies of the supply chain and the price tag on a seed to sale supply chain. I think at one point we had said somewhere between, to start a small, full, seed to sale operation is like $2 to $5 million. What local, small farmer or entrepreneur has that capital? I know when I started a business, I didn't have that capital. I don't have that now, and not a lot of people do. And the answer to this is through incubations and through creating, collaborative partnerships. And we see that a lot in the microbrewery industry in Rochester, right? Where do you see, those parallels between the two industries? Because Rochester right now their microbrewery industry is thriving, right? I feel like there's a new microbrewery popping up on every corner. And I'd say it's safe to say that we could see the same thing when it comes to legalizing cannabis, especially being able to locally source products and all that stuff. How do you see, home cultivation playing into something like this and kind of tying this whole thing together, because we've talked about, the taxation and why it's important to have, a program that favors small businesses, why it's important to replicate, or not allow to not allow vertical integration to protect the small businesses, why we looked at the microbrewery industry as a way, as a model. I think the last piece of the puzzle, and one of the most important aspects of this, especially from a consumer perspective, is home cultivation. How does home cultivation, in your eyes, benefit a small business industry?
Well, so there's a lot to unpack in that, and let's kind of step back for a second and talk about some of the costs. When I've looked at financials for some of my clients that we've worked through the numbers for a small grow, and by small I mean give or take 10,000 square feet, which might not sound that small, but when you have certain companies going into the Buffalo waterfront area that are purchasing about 43 acres, you can tell that 10,000 square feet is small. An acre, for those who don't know, is about 43,000 square feet. So do the math. So just on a 10,000 square foot grow, you're talking about $1 million just to get up and running. And that would leave you with zero operating capital, which would be a terrible, terrible mistake. So really, to be comfortable and to be successful and to really kind of, make sure that when you run into something, when you're starting up your business, which you're going to run into a billion things, you have a little extra money, you probably need about $2 million. So you're talking ballpark $2 million per 10,000 square feet of grow. Granted, as you get bigger and bigger, you benefit from economies of scale, the numbers go down, but you can see they're very large numbers. And as you pointed out, I think correctly, that unless these special one-time fees are astronomical, how much is it really going to help? If you're giving, because one of the goals behind this law is to benefit those communities that have been disproportionately impacted by the cannabis prohibition of the last 80 years. One of those things that we know about those communities, they tend to be on the lower economic scale. And as you pointed out as well, banks aren't just giving money out for this. In fact, most of them are not going to even touch it because it's federally prohibited. They have federal charters. They're not dealing with it.
You can't even get merchant processing for CBD, let alone, a low interest loan for a, THC business.
Exactly. So you're right in that if we had $10 million now to the individual, to you and I, if I said, here's $10 million, you'd be like, sweet, that's awesome. I'm good. How many applicants do we think we're going to get? How many minority applicants? Are we going to get 100? My guess is probably a bit more than that. I think Colorado has about 500 licensees. That's Colorado. They have a fifth of our population. So even if we just did some ballpark extraction on that, or extrapolation on that, we're looking at 2,500 applicants. Start dividing that out. 2,500 applicants, $10 million is not a lot between them. And that's certainly not a lot to start up a business. So to bring this back to your original question of homebrew and home cultivation, I think that it gives people the ability to start doing something in the home. The law right now says up to 6 plants. So it gives you a familiarity. You don't want to fail when it's your income. And it's not just sticking something in the ground and coming back 3 months later to harvest. No, there's a whole science behind it.
It's a process.
So getting people introduced to that, I think, is a good thing. And one of the benefits that we've seen this whole boom in the microbrewery industry is that I think it was like 5-7 years ago, New York State really relaxed its regulations on alcohol. Before, like, you couldn't have, actually, it's kind of funny if we're talking about, our vertical integration, is before you couldn't actually have a fully vertically integrated alcohol business. Like, a distiller couldn't then sell its liquor in a storefront. Not going to work. You have to go through a distributor. The distributor has to sell to a retailer. And that's kind of how it is still right now for the big businesses. If you're a big business, you have to go through a distributor and you have to sell at retail. But they came out with the, what's it called? The farm brew license or something along those lines. where basically said, if you're a small business, however they define that, I'm not sure off the top of my head, you can do everything. And that's what all these microbreweries are, is they're allowed to be fully vertically integrated, but they're small. And the reason that that's important is the MRTA, unlike the CRTA, which the CRTA gave lip service to this, but didn't actually enact it, the MRTA does. It's called the micro business license. And what the micro business license is it's a fully integrated license. You are allowed to cultivate, you are allowed to process, you are allowed to sell at retail. The catch is, though, there's a size limit. Now, they didn't put the size limit in the law. They're going to leave that up to the regulations. And frankly, the regulations are where everything is going to become an issue in this law, because the law is very general. It's kind of an outline, just lays a framework. The regulations are where all the details are. But at least we have this micro business license, which is almost the same thing as the microbrewery license, where we've seen this explosion of local entrepreneurs adding back to the economy. I don't know if you have the article that we had talked about before, where it's added, I think, something like 40,000 jobs to New York or something like that. I mean, it's a significant economic driver. So hopefully we can see that same effect with this micro business license.
Well, it's, Western New York and the Finger Lakes wine region are, like the craft consumable capital of the world. Between having craft beer and craft wine and now having craft cannabis, we can see how easy it would be, or how likely it would be, is that our area could become an even more of a tourist attraction than it already is. And a tourist attraction that, is helping the community and putting money back into communities who have been hurt most by the war on drugs, and incubating small businesses. And when you kind of look at all these different arms of cannabis legalization, you put them together, you can see how this could play out into a really nice storybook ending.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, we have the wine trails that not only do they benefit the wineries, but you have beds and breakfast, you have local restaurants, all the same thing. When I was out in Denver a few months ago, their food scene was insane. And like, I hate stereotypes about, people who smoke pot, but frankly, sometimes the stereotypes are true. Yeah. And their stoner food, for lack of a better term, was gourmet. It was like some of the best, basically junk food I'd ever had in my life. Because this explosion of entrepreneurialism out there with all these ancillary service providers. These people aren't touching the cannabis. These are restaurants, just plain restaurants. But they're creating things that are to a specific segment of the market, and they're hitting it on the head. There's no reason that couldn't happen here. We have wine trails. We can have weed trails.
Yeah, and when we talk about cannabis business, we often just refer to the cultivation, the processing, the retail, yada yada yada. But I feel like the real money is in the ancillary businesses. Think about like the tech platforms that are emerging, companies like STEM Cultivation. Think about service industries, accountants, lawyers, compliance, all that stuff, so a lot of these metrics and a lot of these industry statistics that we hear coming out of Colorado, I always use the example, last year in the first 8 months of 2018, they did $1 billion in cannabis revenue. Well, that's from over-the-counter cannabis transactions. How much money was made in everything else? So what are, things like genetics and, agriculture to agritech, all this stuff that really nobody's talking about, but the ancillary businesses. I mean, I firmly believe that almost any business, especially here in Rochester, could integrate cannabis in some capacity into their already existing, platform. You're seeing it. Small restaurants and places are seeing it in Rochester. I guess, how have you been able to, integrate this into Boyle and Coden? Are your coworkers starting to kind of see, wow, this is something, this is really something serious?
Well, so the firm has been good about it. They've been supportive, and because they recognize that it's pardon the pun, a growth industry. I know, it's wonderful. No, but it's true. So, when we saw the governor's report, as I mentioned earlier, they estimated $300 to $700 million in tax revenue, which everybody kind of like, I think when they first saw it was like, wow, that was low. In fact, I remember a local news station, and I don't remember which one, saying a report of even carrying it up to $1 billion and then saying, oh, well, the New York State budget at the time was $164 billion. So this is less than 1%. And they said only $1 billion. I just wanted anybody listening to this, only $1 billion. You know, it's only $1 billion. Don't worry about
Chump change.
But so what we actually see, though, is if you look at the Rockefeller Institute of Government, they just put out a report that said, hey, if we actually look at the entire economy that cannabis brings along, not just the sale of cannabis, but everything that comes along with it, that'll actually generate between $4 and $8 billion for the government. Now, I don't know about you, but when I'm off by a factor of 1,000, like they or 1,000%, 10 times more revenue, that's probably not going to bode well for me in my job. No. But they, in fact, were, because they didn't look at the overall economy. They didn't look at the fact that this brings in jobs, this brings in service providers, and they all pay taxes. So it's huge. I mean, that, if you look at just those numbers between, let's take the high end and the low end. The high end of the governor's estimate of $700 million and the low end of the Rockefeller Institute at $4 billion. There's a pretty big disparity there of, you know, roughly $3 billion. That $3 billion is non-cannabis. It's ancillary services. So roughly 75% just based on those projections. I mean, I haven't actually done the research, so I can't tell you it's 75%, but just based on those estimations, I think it's probably ballpark. So, I mean, right there you can see that the not cannabis market, the ancillary cannabis market, is huge.
Yeah, I mean, I would imagine that we're going to start seeing some technology in the forms of agri-tech. I mean, think about like all the variables in a grow, you know, lighting and irrigation and nutrients and genetics. I mean, all these industries are bound, you know, these are going to have their own little micro industries, you know, each part of the supply chain, you know, from seed to sale, or actually I heard something earlier, soil to oil, which is pretty cool. Not a Steve original, but pretty good. Each one of these, you know, sub parts of this supply chain is going to see their own economic and innovative growth, which is huge. You know, I think everybody is starting to understand the true capacity that this industry brings, and it's no longer about, you know, smoking pot and getting high. It's about everything else, and that just happens to be a really awesome benefit. I actually got to see firsthand what I believe was a really awesome medical dispensary / adult use program right in Massachusetts. I was in Boston this weekend for a friend's wedding, and I went to visit Netta, which is a dispensary in Brookline. And this was the first time I've ever been to a dispensary in Mass. You know, they haven't been legalized that long. And I drove about 35 minutes from my Airbnb to go to this. I was like, I'm planned half my trip around it. I really wanted to see it. I get all the way there, and there's a line wrapped around the building. Yeah. And I'm not talking about like around the corner, a couple sidewalk squares. I'm talking wrapped around the building, and then like serpentined, like a brand new amusement park was opening. Amusement park ride was opening, okay? So I'm like, you know, it's now or never. So my girlfriend, we get out, we start walking down the sidewalk, and there's tons of people. There's security guards, and there's this one Boston police officer, a co-op, and he was super cool. We're kind of was trying to chatting him up a bit. You know, I had asked him, how has this all been since legalization? Is it, you know, as a nightmare as everyone else in you know, all law enforcement is saying in Rochester, New York? He's like, it's been awesome. It's easy. They're easy clientele, and we're making some money off of it. And he's like, you got to check it out, but it's a 90-minute wait. So we start looking at the menu. We sit down for a minute, really kind of looking at, you know, the menu, and they had flour, concentrate, shatter, everything. But we couldn't justify waiting 90 minutes. So put the menu back. We start walking. We walk past the cop, and he's like, where are you guys going? And I was just like, we can't wait. Unfortunately, it's too long. He goes, come with me. The cop walks us up to the front of the line, to the security guard, and says, these are my friends, can you let us in? We get front row, we bypass the entire line into the dispensary. I was just like, dude, getting walked into a dispensary by a police officer, I was like, you would not believe the opposition that we're getting in New York State from, you know, similar, you know.
Can you come talk to them, please?
Like, you want to fly in? Anytime, we'll have you.
Well, and that's the thing too, and that's what New York has to be careful about, is if we don't have enough licensed dispensaries, we're going to run into that exact problem. And just like you, people are going to be like, you know what? My guy that I've used for 15 years, I don't have to wait for him. He comes to me. That's a big problem.
That's actually a good point. I mean, we're talking about an illicit market. How about long lines? Not many people have 90 minutes to sit outside, and not to mention you get up there and you only, if they put limits on it, which I'm sure they will.
Absolutely.
If you're an adult use patient in Massachusetts, you can get an eighth of flower and up to 10 pre-rolls, and if you're a medical patient, you get like 5x that. So it's like, am I going to wait 90 minutes to be able to get an eighth, or I could have my guy drive to my house and drop me off 10 times that, So it's...
Well, and it's very different, out in Colorado, it's been, 4 or 5 years now that it's been legal. Out there, it's not even a thing. Like, you might wait in line just because they kind of chunk it out. Like they'll let in a group of like 3 or 4 people, they do their thing, and then you wait in like the outer room and then you go in. So, but like the waiting online there is like a minute to 5 minutes. And I think that's acceptable for most people. Most people would be like, okay, I can spare 5 minutes. 90 minutes? I mean, that's a problem. So New York hopefully will take a look at Massachusetts and be like, we are not going to do that, because that's just going to drive people right to the illicit market. But it's also interesting to note that I think it's that one. Also the one in the Berkshires. I'm not super familiar with
Berkshire Roots.
I don't know. Yeah, somewhere around there. Not totally familiar with. I lived in Boston for 9 months. That's all I got.
Wow.
But they have a huge, huge influx of people from New York and Pennsylvania and New Jersey and Connecticut. If New York legalizes, we can assume that the exact same thing is going to happen here. And if we have like 4 dispensaries in the state, we're going to have a big problem, because the local people who have all those connections, they're never going to wait. It's just they're going to leave it to the out-of-staters to wait because they don't have a choice. And the in-staters are just not going to go to the dispensaries.
Yeah, there's definitely, like we kind of started the episode, is a sweet spot to all of this. And I think that from where we started and where we are now, we're very, very close. We're actually going to, and after this podcast, we're going to hop in the car and we're going to head to Albany for a very jam-packed lobby day tomorrow. It is going to be what I think will be a day for the books. I think that we're going to see a win in New York. I think it's going to be a win that everybody feels, and whether it's what was our opposition is now, everybody is going to get impacted by this in some way, shape, or form. And with that, I want to thank you so much for coming on here. I'm sure this will not be the last time that you're on here. I truly think that you are going to leave a historical impact on this industry, whether you are a CEO of a $1 billion company or sitting next to Axel, writing legislation. I think that your future is going to be very bright, and I'm glad to have you on the team. I'm glad we got to sit down today.
Well, thank you. And I just want to say too that I've watched Roc NORML since its inception to now, and I think that what you guys have done, and I guess I can now include myself since I'm part of it, has been amazing. And I honestly think that Roc NORML is probably the most influential grassroots organization in New York right now. I think Roc NORML is driving this bill more than any other thing. I think that you guys have done more than NORML has. I don't think I've seen anybody as successful in any legal state as you guys have. So I think that that's a huge feather in your cap. Keep doing what you're doing because it's working.
Yeah, we've done it intelligently, and we knew that this was going to be a team expert, and we had to practice what we preach about bringing the right people to the right table to have the right conversations, to answer all the tough questions. And, after a year and a half of, starting it as a very organic, organization to this now very influential organization is comprised of a heavy hitting team of experts, and it wouldn't be possible with all of us and sharing our expertise. And not to mention this is all volunteer, and I think we can all sleep easy at night knowing that we will have had a long term historical impact on this industry. I firmly believe that.
Agreed.
Yeah. So with that being said, I want to thank Jason for being on the show. Until next time, this is Steve Vanderwall with Roc NORML Radio, and we are out.